Since I'm a biblical scholar and one of the few biblical scholars that really spends any time in sort of the fringe world, I get the question about UFOs in the Bible or UFOs and the Bible all of the time. I've done a lot of radio shows that we would typically classify as New Age or paranormal, and of course spoken at conferences too. And if I had $1 for every time I've had someone walk up to me and say, hey, I found UFOs in the Bible, or ask me, are there UFOs in the Bible? I'd have a pretty good pile of cash by this point. Now, the question seems pretty odd, but it's actually kind of normal, because typically the person who asked the question, they're coming from the perspective of someone who's had an experience. Maybe they've seen something in the sky and they don't know what it is, or they know someone, maybe a close relative or just a trusted friend, someone who really wouldn't lie to them about some experience they've had. And maybe they've seen a TV show or they've heard a radio show that sort of puts the thought in their mind that whatever they saw was extraterrestrial from another world. And that really disturbs them. A lot of people really are disturbed by the thought, especially if they're Christians. And so in many cases, I've found that people ask the question because they're trying to process the experience or the thought or what they've seen or heard in such a way that allows them to sort of keep their faith and keep the Bible. So on the one hand, that's completely understandable. But on the other hand, we have to stop and think about what it involves. When you ask a question about flying saucers or UFOs in the Bible, you're really treading on something important that we like to call context. Now, anyone who's into Bible study or interpreting Scripture talks about context a lot. And we have to be careful here because the right way to think about the Bible is not to impose a modern context onto it. The result of that is you're making the biblical writers say things that they really didn't intend to say. And we don't like that when we write something or say something. We want to be understood in the context in which we said it or wrote it. And the same thing is true of the Bible. So the right context for interpreting the Bible is the context that produced the Bible, not a modern technological, scientific, or science fiction-y context. And that's going to become important as we talk about the whole question of whether certain passages in the Bible are talking about flying saucers. Probably the go-to passage in the Bible to talk about UFOs, or at least so people think, is Ezekiel chapter 1. Now, this is the famous, bizarre vision that Ezekiel has in Babylon by the river Kebar, just after being taken captive by the Babylonians. And this is the one where we get the wheels within the wheels, and you get the bright fire and the luminescence and so on and so forth. And a lot of people look at this and think, wow, that must be a flying saucer. It's bright, and it's shiny, and it's fiery, and it's round, it's got wheels, and so on and so forth. But they never really take a close look at the passage because, again, we're imposing a modern context on Ezekiel 1. It might surprise people to realize that every element of this vision, every one, is known from Babylonian material. In other words, we actually know what Ezekiel saw because of iconography, statues or carvings from the ancient world, and specifically from Mesopotamia, Assyria, Babylon, even Canaan and Phoenicia. This is a very common description that we get in Ezekiel 1 of a very particular known thing. Now, we have a deity on a throne. The word throne is actually in the passage. Most UFOs that I think we would be familiar with from stories or movies don't have chairs sitting on top of them. We have luminescence for sure. We have a deity that's in human form. It's not a creature, not an alien, anything like that. We have wheels underneath. Again, UFOs, at least as we commonly think of them, being technologically advanced, don't need wheels. But here we have them in Ezekiel 1. And of course, we have fire. People don't stop to think of something like, well, fire in a UFO, that means it has an internal combustion engine, which of course is impossible when you're talking about space travel. But again, the point is that people want to find these things in Scripture, in the Bible, in Ezekiel 1, because they're really thinking about a deeper question. They're trying to process an experience or something they saw on television with the Bible so that they can keep the Bible, or at least feel like the Bible fits into their world. But in Ezekiel 1, it really violates what the whole point of the passage is. Now, in the vision, we have discussion of cherubim. And we do have cherubim with 4 faces. They are sitting facing outward underneath a round platform on top of which is a throne. On top of that is a very human-looking deity that Ezekiel calls the glory of God, or the glory. And in chapter 10, where we get the same vision, it's the God of Israel in human form. And we know what that looks like because of lots of other passages in the Bible. But what about the cherubim? What about the whole setup, the wheels and the platform and the throne? Again, all of these things are known from Mesopotamian iconography and sculpture. It's not a coincidence, for example, that the 4 faces of the cherubim in Ezekiel 1 are the 4 cardinal points of the Babylonian zodiac. Now that might sound really odd, but you have to factor in that particular detail to understand what in the world's going on. We have the 4 faces, the 4 items, the 4 figures of the Babylonian zodiac, and there's a throne, a deity, on top of them. The messaging is actually pretty clear, that the deity enthroned above this platform, which is very common. You can find cherubim thrones all over the ancient world in carvings. It's a stock description of where a deity or a human king would sit. Cherubim were throne guardians. But in this case, the faces are really important because the idea is that the deity is in control of the 4 corners of the earth. And because they're situated in the zodiac for the Babylonians, and that's where Ezekiel's at. He's in Babylon, and so people are going to be familiar with the imagery. The idea being conveyed is that the zodiac, as it cycles through time, as it cycles through the sky, and tracks time, tracks the passage of history, the events of humanity, who's in control of time? Who's in control of these cycles of life? Who is in control of human history? Well, it's the enthroned deity. And guess who's on the throne? It's not the Babylonian god Marduk. It's the God of Israel. And the message to the captives in Babylon is significant. You're here in Babylon. You're the people of God, and you're wondering, how in the world did you ever get here? Why were you kicked out of the land? Why is this happening to you? Did Marduk just defeat your God? And the answer is no. The God of Israel is still the one in control. He is still in control of human history. You will not be here forever. He is in charge. He is still on the throne. That's the message of Ezekiel 1, not a flying saucer with internal combustion engines from somewhere else in the solar system. The other passage that people often think about when they talk about UFOs in the Bible, or at least try to justify that idea, is the story of Elijah being taken to heaven and the chariot of fire. Now, I said that deliberately. Elijah is taken to heaven, and there's a chariot of fire in the picture. Believe it or not, Elijah is never actually said to get in the chariot. The chariot is never actually said to take Elijah anywhere. But that idea is imposed on the passage, and that's why people look at it and they start talking about flying saucers and UFOs. If you actually look at the passage again closely, and we have, again, contextual issues here that we really need to think about, you see the description. Yeah, there's a chariot of fire. There are also horses of fire. Now, I would suggest that the biblical writer knew what horses were, and it's sort of not, normative to have horses of fire, but he doesn't call them something else. He doesn't call them, some sort of mechanical feature that we would associate with a UFO. He calls them horses of fire, so he can make out the outline of a horse at the very least. And so that alone should sort of disqualify the passage from anything that we would normally think of as a flying saucer. You also have to notice the fire. So here we'd have another case of an internal combustion engine capable of space travel. Again, we know these things are not scientifically coherent, and they're also not textually coherent. Again, horses of fire are not going to be a substitute for something else. The biblical writer knows what a horse looks like, and that's the terminology that's used. We need to be a little more careful and take a look at the passage more closely. The thing that Elijah is taken up into or taken up by to heaven is a whirlwind. This is a stock description in the Old Testament for God or God's presence. Again, God doesn't need a spaceship. We don't have a spaceship here. But kings and deities were said to travel about in chariots. And when it came to a deity, it would be a fiery chariot or a heavenly chariot. This is what's being described. And so Elijah has a vision of a chariot that belongs to God in this case, and it's fiery because fire was associated with divine presence, the glory, just like we saw in Ezekiel 1. But he can make out the outlines of a chariot and horses and so on and so forth. So we know that God is there in the scene somewhere, but Elijah never gets into the thing, and it never takes him anywhere. He is taken up in a whirlwind. This is 2 Kings 2, 9 through 12. If you just read it, you will see that these details do not conform, again, to something you'd expect for a flying saucer. And of course, the argument always is, well, maybe, they're seeing something that they can't decipher. But did you just track with what I was saying? They're looking at something. Elijah is seeing something that he can decipher. He can process it. They knew what chariots and horses and fire looked like. They have the vocabulary for other things like silver and disc and round and windows. Again, the things you'd associate today with a flying saucer. But that's not what is described in this passage. And this is the way it goes. With the discussion of UFOs in the Bible, we always seem to end up with a situation where people will be imposing things from the science fiction world or something they saw on History Channel or some other television program, or again, what we typically conceive of as a flying saucer, and they will impose it onto the biblical text and then justify doing so in some way. And I'm not here to more or less complain about that. I'm here to alert us to the fact that we need to think a little more clearly about what's happening when people ask the question and approach the Bible this way. Typically, they're looking for a way to process a thought or an event either they or someone they trust had, and they want to be able to keep the Bible or keep their faith in connection with that. But the answer to doing that really isn't interpreting the Bible poorly. The answers to that can be found in thinking more clearly about whatever that experience or thing you heard on TV is really saying.